Hello, 603 students. Wanted to go over week 1 readings. This week you were reading the beginning part of the school law book and chapter 1 of the school law book, the preventative law. Preventative law is something that as a school administrator can help stop problems before they begin. It is exactly that. It's prevention. And this whole book is actually about prevention, trying to prevent getting yourself in a situation when you are a school administrator that lands you dealing with the court system. Oh, sorry. The biggest thing that you have to remember is that if you do end up in a lawsuit or accused of violating someone's rights, the courts will not accept as your defense that you were unaware of laws or statutes, codes. So you can't claim ignorance. The biggest thing is you want to stay out of a lawsuit. We're going to look at historic lawsuits and how they have formed our education system. And we're also going to look at the reasoning or the facts in the case, because that is what is important. You will read, as we are reading this book, that there are conclusions or opinions that are made by judges. That does not go into the decision necessarily. It is not seen as precedent, but it does give you a view into what their thoughts were. So as a school-based administrator, there is a big ethical dilemma between the legal side of things and then the moral side of things. One of the examples the book gives is about not how districts may have policies regarding students in making symbols like gun symbols or drawing about weapons. And then you have a first grader who makes the symbol of a gun with their hand. And many of our policies state that we are to suspend the child. But it could be that the child was out at recess playing with another student. You have to look at each of those individual situations. And I feel a lot of times as a practicing principal, I am put in the middle of district policy and expectations in reality, because my name is the one that will be out on the news, not the person that helped guide me in the decision, because ultimately it is my decision. So hopefully after this class and after reading this book, there will be a little better of ease in what the decision should be. Law is extremely important when it comes to the day-to-day operations in a school. Now, do you need to know, as a practicing school-based administrator, the exact historic case, precedent-setting case, and what the decision was and why? No, you don't. What you need to know is the thoughts behind those landmark cases and trying to apply the court's decision to events which will occur in your building daily. The other thing that you will rely on is your school board policy, your student code of conduct. I say all the time that's the law of the land in a school. It is your school board policy, your code of conduct. And when I have been challenged by my upper administration on decisions that I have made when I have been able to take it back to their school board policy and how it applies, and or their code of conduct and how it applies. That tends to help my situation and their support. So in this book, at the very beginning, page 4 to the top of page 5 gives some examples of some of the ethical versus moral decision making. So I would suggest that you read that. But chapter 1 talks a lot about prevention. How do you keep yourself out of a lawsuit? And also, how do you keep yourself out of being liable for something? So it's being proactive. So preventative law is, by definition, is to regulate human conduct to ensure a harmonious society by attempting to strike a balance between allowing individuals as much freedom as possible and enabling society to function without unreasonable interference from the conduct of individuals. It should be a high priority. So preventative law is a lot of times defined as a program. Really, it should be a mindset. But there should be policies, procedures, and regulations that support it. And it should be, the goal should be to minimize the risk of litigation or to secure the legal rights and duties. So in preventive law, there's importance of pre-facto planning, which is before the problem. And then identify potential risks. They had a whole risk analysis formula, risk identification and risk analysis. Basically, your district emergency plans, your school emergency plans are considered preventive. So get a hold of your emergency plans, school-based as well as district-based. And what do they say? How can you see preventive law in there? Unfortunately, when a school incident does occur, the number one thing that the news media and just society in general looks at is what type of prevention did that school try to do, whether it was prevention against a dangerous individual, prevention in practicing their emergency procedures, any type of prevention. The book also mentioned a little bit about working with the media, and they were a little more, they talked a little more about being cooperative with them, but I'm going to tell you something different. I am contacted by the media almost on a weekly basis. A lot of times it's because we're a very high profile, very convenient high school. So they contact me wanting to take pictures of our students getting on school buses because it's National School Bus Safety Week or whatever. But every now and then they do contact you because of bad things. So a couple of words of wisdom. Absolutely nothing is off the record when you're talking to the media. Absolutely nothing. Now, in my area, we do have a county newspaper, the Gaston Gazette. And there is an education reporter, Eric. And so he typically handles all of the situations that have to do with something going on in the school system except sports. He deals with the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then we have one primary sports writer, Jack, and he deals with high school, middle school sports, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I have built relationships with Eric and Jack so that there can be some trust there. But you have to remember every time you are speaking to anyone that works for the media, and where a lot of principals get themselves in some trouble is when they have a parent, a member of their PTA, PTO, or the spouse of a journalist on their staff, they forget that that person is also a journalist. And the other recommendation is follow your district policy. We have a director of communications, and if the Gazette is wanting to do some sort of article or want to take pictures of our students loading buses, he will contact me and say, hey, you know, they're going to be here on this date, it's approved, you know, it's nothing bad. Otherwise, anytime someone from any sort of media, and when I say any sort of media, I was actually contacted by the Today Show this year. How they received my school name, I have no idea. Wasn't anything specific about us. But I will not speak with anyone. I let them know, and I have my front office trained to state all requests must go through our director of communications. Because sometimes the media will not contact you by phone or email. They will just walk in your front door. And so I have had to train the secretaries, the lead bus driver that sits up there. Don't say anything that the media will overhear, that the journalist that's sitting in the front office will overhear. And with that, I also have to let them know when I'm expecting someone from the Gazette or from one of the local news stations so that they don't turn them away and send them on to our director of communications. So you just have to be very cautious. You have to be cautious about letting them on your campus. You know, media is not allowed on your campus unless you invite them onto your campus. So if there is a bad situation, because that happens, and someone sets up a TV camera on your campus, you have every right and responsibility to remove them from your campus. I would not do that without having your resource officer, if you have one. And I also would not do that without communicating with your central office, your director of communications, whatever your protocol is. But a lot of times I am on the phone with that person while I am removing the media from my campus. So you need to really look at your district policy and rules of thumb when it comes to media. The next thing that we were supposed to look at for this week was the Leandro case. There were 5 about 10-minute long YouTube videos about the Leandro case. And also we were supposed to read about the top 10 education issues. So for those of you in North Carolina, the Leandro case is something that we know probably better by the judge that oversaw the Leandro case after it made it through the state Supreme Court, and that was Judge Manning. So let's look at the facts of the Leandro case. The case was brought by parents in districts of low wealth. Their claim was that their children were not given an equal opportunity for an equal education. And they claimed this based on standardized test results, and they accused the state of not funding appropriately. So in the state of North Carolina, each school system is funded based on a per pupil expenditure and then also funded based on property tax. So if you're in a low wealth district, your property tax does not necessarily mean that you're going to make very much money, because usually low wealth, the property is not as, doesn't have as big of a value. So the original decision about the courts was for the plaintiff, the parents or the districts. The decision was appealed, and the appellate courts reversed the decision, stating the Constitution has a right to a public education. That's what it states, that the citizens have a right to a public education. And they were receiving that public education. There's nothing that addresses the qualitative level. It is just that says that each state is to have a public school system. And they stated it is not a justiciable issue. I have trouble saying that word, meaning it's not something the courts get into. So the case went on to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court asked the following 3 questions. Is there a constitutional right? If so, is there a substantive aspect to it? In order to meet this need, must the children have an opportunity to really learn? So in order to have the constitutional right to have an education, is there some sort of requirement that has to be met in order for the children to really learn? And do all schools have to be funded the same? So the court held there was a substantive aspect, and it must have a qualitative element. So the courts defined what an education will provide students. 1 was sufficient ability to read, write, and speak the English language, sufficient knowledge of math and physical science, and enable the student to function in a rapidly changing society. The second was sufficient fundamental knowledge of history, geography, basic economic and political systems to enable the student to make informed choices with regard to issues which affect the student personally or the student's community, state, or nation. And really, number 2 goes back to what was the purpose of a school? And it was to educate our citizens to make good civic and political decisions. Number 3, sufficient academic vocational skills to enable the student to successfully engage in post-secondary education or vocational training, meaning that they learn the skills enough to get a job. And number 4, sufficient academic and vocational skills to enable the student to compete on an equal basis with others with further formal education or gainful employment in contemporary society. So what they also looked at was the Equal Opportunity Clause of the state of the Constitution, and they were convinced that the Equal Opportunity Clause of the state constitution does not require substantial equal funding or educational advantages in all districts, and that this was an educational achievement case, not an input but an output. And they talked about the input being it's not monetary. It has nothing to do with money or decisions on how the state education system is run. It has everything to do with the outcome, the test scores. Are those low wealth districts or those low income schools producing the same quality student as their counterparts of middle or high wealth? So basically they said that the education system is left up to the legislative and executive branches to run. So they knew, the state Supreme Court knew that this was going to open up many other cases. So the Chief Justice appointed Judge Howard Manning Jr. to the case. Instead of looking at individual families that filed in the Leandro case in the several school districts, because as the Leandro case was going on, then districts, some of the large districts in the state joined in. So they focused on Hoke County. Hoke County is a small county that is farm and country. And they also were, their students did not do well on the output on the standardized tests. So they worked really hard to keep the federal government out. So the state Supreme Court wanted to handle it on this level before anybody filed something in the federal courts. But the question of who is responsible became the issue. So the governor at the time stated that the state wasn't responsible because they provided funding per ADM, which is the average daily membership. And it was up to each LEA or local education agency to manage it. So the governor basically said, we're out because we provide the same amount of money per child for the average daily membership, and possibly Hoke County or some of these other districts, that their internal structures were not managing the money well. So then Judge Manning looked specifically at what is the measure of a sound basic education. Well, in North Carolina, they said a level 2 was a sound basic education. And this was when our standardized scores, our EOCs or EOGs, were levels 1, 2, 3, or 4, where a 3 and 4 was considered proficient, but that they said if you made a level 2, that it was a sound basic education. Judge Manning said, nope, we're going to change that to a level 3 or above. That point just kind of cracked me up, because I kind of thought, he says that he's going to leave it to the legislative and executive branch, but not the courts, the judicial branch, to make decisions about education. Yet he's making those decisions. So then they looked at how can districts be compared if the funding amount is different. So Judge Manning found the measure of a sound basic education had nothing to do with money. He studied and found schools that were in low wealth districts, or districts that were low wealth, that were producing students that had a sound basic education. He started to study why, and it came down to the quality of the teacher and the principal. So then he came up with a criteria for districts to be considered Leandro compliant. They must do the following 4 things: have a certified competent principal in every school, have a certified competent teacher in every classroom who differentiates instruction and assesses students weekly. They must have resources to do so, and they must have a pre-K at-risk preschool. And if the district is not Leandro compliant, then the courts would step in. But the courts do not make the decision to financially provide. And since 2005, Judge Manning fined schools who are outperforming based on demographics. So when I first became a school administrator, I remember several of our high schools were considered by Judge Manning to be low performing and not Leandro compliant. And they had to have these very specific detailed plans. They had to have meetings in Raleigh. I mean, it really took the focus and their energy away from becoming Leandro compliant, trying to help their students. And they started to call it the "we suck" meetings, when they would say, oh, well, I've got to be in Raleigh all week because I have to have my "we suck" meetings with Judge Manning and the Leandro compliance team. So it really, in the education world in North Carolina, has a negative has a negative reputation, more if you were involved or impacted by it. So we also were to read the top 10 educational issues for this year in the state of North Carolina. So the first one was exercise strong educational leadership for North Carolina's children. And it detailed the Leandro lawsuit is now assigned to W. David Lee. I didn't even know that, and I just think that's rather interesting. And some people are calling for increased funding for alternatives to public schools, such as private school vouchers, increased choice within the public school system. The second top educational issue was to fund North Carolina public schools fairly and adequately. And they looked at, had a chart of funding for low versus high wealth counties. Number 3 was to make teaching in North Carolina great again, invest in teacher pay, use differential pay to create more opportunities. Now that second bullet, differential pay, some of us know it as merit pay, some of us know it as pay for test scores, where there will be opportunities to earn more money based on how well you as a teacher perform, how well your school performs, whether you are a Title I school, you have a better opportunity for greater opportunities at differential pay. The state has not come up with a system. I know a couple of years ago, they allowed districts to submit something, but then the state just never followed through with it. Number 4 was improve access, equity, and accountability in school choice. So I just recently heard about this in one of my principals meetings in my district, that the state, instead of states coming and taking over schools or deeming the schools unfit, in North Carolina, they have a new school district. It's called the NC New Achievement School District, or ASD. And it is optional right now, where the state's lowest performing schools will be placed in a separate statewide district with its own superintendent. So if there is school X in Gaston County that is deemed one of the state's lowest performing schools, they can choose to be removed from Gaston County Schools and be placed in this Achievement School District. And the Achievement School District will contract with outside groups such as nonprofit or for-profit charter management organizations to run the schools. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. That a low-performing school, public school, can remove themselves from the school district with which they reside, join this Achievement School District, and then this district will contract with outside groups like a charter school, nonprofit or for-profit, to come in and run the schools. I worry about what can of worms that's going to open up, especially in this day and age where parents have a lot of school choice. I am very pro public education, and I know some schools a lot of people consider charter schools public charter schools, but they're not run with the same rules, requirements, expectations. So just, if you're in a public system like I am, just let that sink in for a minute. Number 5, overhaul principal pay and invest in preparing the next generation of school leaders. I thought, heck yeah, give me some more money. But preparing the next generation of school leaders, things like the Principal Fellows program or other type programs that will help really take the potential for those of you who are wanting to be school leaders and have programs to help prepare you the best possible. Number 6, maintain a strong focus on race in public education. It talked about discipline disparities that continue to persist, and overrepresentation in special education and underrepresentation in rigorous courses and programs. That is something that I know my district has talked about a lot, is the representation of any school program, whether it is special needs, AIG, advanced placement courses, any of those, that if the demographics of my school are 60% majority and 40% minority, then that should be the representation in all of those programs and in my discipline data. My current school is kind of the 30-30-30 school, very diverse. So when I walk into an AP course or an honors course, I should see that same type of diversity. When I walk into an occupational classroom, which is a separate EC classroom, I should see the same representation of our demographics. Number 7, improve grade level reading through comprehensive investments in early childhood. Number 8, enable the transition to personalized digital age learning models. Number 9, create meaningful and streamlined assessments. The third paragraph was very interesting, had interesting guidelines which could change North Carolina testing. And as a lot of us are experiencing in North Carolina, our testing is online. And I know in my school, the students have struggled, and being in a high school, the students tend to express their opinions quite eloquently. What they've struggled with is there is no way the teachers can teach in the same program that the students are going to be assessed. So my teachers do a really good job of digitizing a lot of their learning, especially language arts teachers, because no longer do we need the highlighters to be able to have that active reading and that notation during reading, because it's online. And how do you do that? And there are ways to do that even through the state testing, but there's no way to practice in that same format. So the kids have said, by the time I figure out how to highlight, I'm almost out of time. But also about how the state testing system could be more of a formative measure, where they may give a third grade reading EOG in November. rather than in May. And so just very interesting options. I would strongly encourage you go back and look at those guidelines in the third paragraph. And the last one was increased support for the state's struggling schools. Week 2 has a ton of information regarding very important legal things. So the readings video will be coming out shortly, but please try to digest it all. We will revisit a lot of those topics throughout the rest of the semester. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Have a good week.